This is your PowerPoint lecture on human migration from the classical to the modern periods. What I want to try and give to you is kind of a culmination of pulling together a lot of what we've talked about human beings moving from mostly our established major empires, and what that meant as humans migrated from one area to the next, and see if we can see some patterns that are happening between a lot of these different periods, the classical, the post-classical, and the early modern periods. This is then going to set us up long term to see where the differences are today with the types of movements that we're seeing in the 20th and 21st century. Probably overall, the pattern that we want to see here is to see how empires were shifting back and forth due to the migrations of people coming in and conquering and destabilizing them. But then moving into the early modern period in which really the Industrial Revolution and exploration impacts the way people move around the world, much more for labor, not for the establishment so much of empires. So the classical migrations. The context for the classical migrations, remember, is the formation of empires. Remember, as we talked about human origins, as human beings moved out of areas and established sedentary societies, eventually these societies formed into these large empires. And the difference between the classical and the post-classical is really a matter of degree about these empires. Migration tended to be connected with the diffusion of political authority over large land masses. For example, Alexander the Great, who would diffuse Greek culture throughout the area, ranging all the way from northern Africa out into India, is considered to be one of these what we call big men, okay, meaning a charismatic leader. He spread out the Macedonian and Greek influence into places like Egypt, the Middle East, and India. Rome, very similarly, moved from a small farming republic into an empire in northern Africa, southern and northern Europe. In case of China, the Han and the Qin empires spread out westward and centralized control. The idea that in these classical migration was really established or really had the biggest impact on people moving out in these empires and creating a more centralized empire that expanded out and took over different regions. The big man. So a big part of this has to do with this leadership of what is known as the big man, or a charismatic leader that is able to use both punishments but also really a cult of personality in order to develop centralized control. The diffusion of culture and power began really as a theme at this time period. The big man would establish a strong empire and then codify his power through legal systems. Like, for example, Ashoka created the Buddhist legal system in India in order to centralize northern India. Hammurabi created a legal system in Babylon. In Rome, the emperors created the notion of Pax Romana, in which basically the Roman influence through legal systems would establish a centralized empire. The idea behind all of this is that a big man was able to take that overall charisma and then diffuse it or centralize it into codified law. There was an underlying weakness, though, at this time period, and that was that a lot of these leaders really relied more upon their charisma than on codified law and processes. And so oftentimes what we saw at the end of their rule was the empire falling apart because they were no longer in charge. Now, one of the other big themes at this time period has to do with the development of trade routes and how that impacted migration. So the big trade routes of the classical and post-classical period are the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and eventually the Trans-Saharan. As these different types of trade routes are established, they connect up different regions of the world, and you start to see port cities created, especially along the East African and West Indian coast. That leads to cultural diffusion of Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Islam. All these major religions are interflowing with each other, which really undermines this whole notion that societies had developed isolated from one another. And for most of world history, to be quite honest, humans were in interaction with each other. In fact, historians look back and they see it as what's called cultural bubbles, in which basically you would have interactions, and then there would be areas in which it was kind of a little bit more isolated, but then you would get right back into bubbles in which people were connected. So even though it's not quite as intense as we see today, interaction was pretty regular throughout this time period. This also allowed for the massive exchanges in what are known as luxury versus exotic goods, meaning that people would go out and they would want to get goods that weren't within their region, weren't within their area, but they wanted this. This then attracted more migration and attracted more trade. The trade that we see at this time period was largely peaceful, and it led to changes mainly through the mixture of merchants' beliefs. I think what's so important about that to remember is that our modern notion today is that human beings have been so violent and that most of our interactions have been through war. Actually, the truth is the underlying consistency in our interactions has been trade, and it's been a peaceful trade that has diffused both goods and ideas. Now we get into the post-classical era. So what was the big difference? Well, I think there are two big differences in migrations and the centralization of empires. So on the one hand, one of the big differences has to do with the degree of empires themselves. In the classical era, empires are just getting going. And so they are large and they are land-based empires, but they're not quite as centralized. There's another big theme that's a little bit different. It has to do with once these trade routes get established, you start to see what are known as the steppe invaders, who are going to have a massive influence on most empires. Large land empires at this time period in the post-classical era were much more established. They were much more centralized because of the development in the classical era. At the same time, they were being consistently undermined by these new groups coming from what is known as the steppe region. The steppe region is the area just north of Central Asia and the high plateaus and the high mountains of that region. This area can support small tribes. They do farming and hunting and gathering, but the resources in those areas are rather scarce, which means that people in those areas were constantly moving around trying to find new resources. And as they did that over time, they would come together, as we saw last week under Genghis Khan is a really good example with the Mongols, and they would then come down off of these steppe plateau regions down into places like northern India, northern China, even out into the Middle East, and they would conquer. So for example, the Chinese Song dynasty was eventually conquered over time by first the Jurchens and then the Mongols, who would form the Yuan dynasty. Northern India was in constant flux with Muslim invaders from the north. The Crusades were really the result of Turkish invaders coming from the steppe region and basically incorporating the Islamic attitudes of the Middle East and then going in and conquering the areas in the Middle East. The effects of disease. So, as migrations took place, one of the biggest themes or one of the biggest impacts would be disease and how that impacted society. You can kind of know about this from your own life. I'm sure at some point as you've moved from schools to schools or if you've met new people, you probably have noticed that you tend to get more colds, or maybe you get a flu that year you haven't gotten in the past. Why is that the case? Well, as we meet new people and get in new circumstances, our body needs time to develop immunological defenses. That was especially true as migrations and trade was taking place. The most famous was the spread of the Black Death, or the bubonic plague in the 1300s. This was passed on through fleas, which was then passed on to rats and then to human populations. It started in China, then spread out through the Silk Roads and the Indian Ocean trade routes. It was carried by merchant ships. By the time it was done in Europe alone, 50 million people, or 60% of the European population, died. So as we can see, as migration and these new types of trade routes were formed, one of the biggest problems that was going to be faced was the interactions of people leading into not just the spread of new ideas, not just the spread of new technologies, but the spread of disease itself. That would have massive impacts on how society was going to be organized and how it would develop further. What were the changes to the social order? Well, as the Black Plague led to a lack of labor in the fields, landowners realized that they had to raise wages in order to try to attract people to come and work for them. But that raise over time, they just simply could not afford. So they looked to new ways that they could replace workers, and they came up with a way called the three-field rotation system, in which one part of their field would lay fallow for a year, another part of their field they would plant one type of crop, and in a third field they would plant a third type of crop, or a second type of crop. What they would do then is that they would switch these fields around year by year. What ended up happening was there was less and less of a need for workers, so the workers were kicked off of the land, and they had to go into small cities. Now, this might sound really bad, and to a certain extent it was for the workers who were losing their jobs out on the fields. But like with most developments in society, we can call this, there was a famous word used for this to describe capitalism by a man named Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter called this creative destruction, in which, yes, people lose jobs, this is destructive, but there's also a creation that comes afterwards. In this particular case, as people went to small cities, over time there was the growth of a merchant class and the beginnings of exploration. So notice here that migration, disease, interaction just leads to further amounts of trade, development, and innovation as society moves forward. And this, of course, leads into our modern migration and then the diffusion of new types of navigational tools that will allow for migration. The Polo family themselves migrated, traveled along the Silk Road, and eventually came upon the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. The Polos would bring back from Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty new types of technologies like the astrolabe, the compass, and lateen sails. All of this would allow Europeans to go out and explore and to discover new lands. At the same time, other groups of people were also exploring and doing migration. One of the most famous before Christopher Columbus would go out was Zheng He. Zheng He, coming from the Chinese dynasties, The Chinese dynasty, the Ming dynasty, would explore India and Eastern Africa. Ibn Battuta, from the Muslim empires of that time period, the gunpowder empires, was an explorer who would document the spread of Islam in Africa and the Middle East. Eventually, these new types of migrations, this modern migration that was taking place along the Atlantic Ocean, was going to change towards the economic system of mercantilism and the need for raw resources. Spain was first, establishing New Spain in the southwest of the Americas with its military and religious outposts. France then established New France in Louisiana territory with trade settlements, and then England established New England. Now, England is actually going to have a slightly different way in which they're going to do migration and exploration. They're going to settle with family settlements out on the East Coast. Now, the reason why that's so important when you think about it is that when we think of our English ancestors, who we come from in North America, really they had the smallest amount of land, those 13 colonies that were established out on the East Coast. In fact, if anything, they were surrounded by their enemies. They were surrounded by France out in what was known eventually as the Louisiana Territory, and Spain, which was out in the southwest, and in Florida. But England, by establishing family settlements, allowed for long-term stability. So their migrational pattern was going to be the most important, the most successful in the long term. England also was going to change the labor system that was happening at that time period by populating their colonies with what were called indentured servants, people who came to the Americas to pay off their debt. So basically somebody here in the Americas would pay for them to come. They would then work for that family for 7 years, and at the end, they would then get freedom and land. Over time, though, that became expensive for the people who actually lived here in the Americas, and so they began looking for a new form of labor, and they found it in African slaves. So basically, this establishes what we know today as the modern system of racial slavery, which was a transatlantic trade of Africans across from Western Africa into the Caribbean, and then they would be sold out into places like Brazil and the United States. The largest amount of African slaves tended to be traded within the Caribbean and Brazil because that was where huge plantations were done for sugar trade. However, North America, while it did get very few of these slaves overall, would eventually develop a very large African slave population as they were used in order to farm things like tobacco and then eventually cotton, rice, and what was known as indigo, or a type of dye. Now, eventually what was going to happen back in England was something known as the Enclosure Movement, which was an internal migration system that took place within this early modern period. Traditionally, poor people within England had been allowed to do what's called squatting on the land. What that meant was that they were allowed to live on the land of a major landowner as long as they would basically clean up the land. This benefited both sides. The poor would basically be able to get food to survive. Rich landowners benefited because the land was cleaned off and eventually they could farm on that land. But when the Industrial Revolution came along, these rich landowners wanted to use every bit of the land they could in order to mass produce. And so they took these peasants who had been squatting on the land and kicked them off the land and then closed off the land, therefore called the Enclosure Movement. So where did these peasants go? Well, they went to one of two places. Peasants went into cities, or eventually they went out to the Americas and other colonies in order to settle and find land there. What ended up happening was the peasants who went into cities looked for jobs, leading to a massive new labor force for factories, or they went to the colonies where they were eventually able to establish these colonies, and of course we know eventually gained their independence, especially in America. I think what's important about this migrational system is it's just an extension of what we're seeing here in this early modern period of the establishment of a labor force for merchants and then for factories. And that leads us up to the industrial labor system of this early modern period. The Industrial Revolution was going to change the dynamics of rural and urban populations altogether. During the 1800s, the primary demographic movement was people moving towards urban centers. New agricultural techniques were basically making large-scale agricultural labor less needed. So like, for example, things like the diesel engine, fertilizer, barbed wire, and other new types of crops would make it possible for farmers to grow massive amounts of crops without needing much labor, which meant that we saw labor basically shifting from a rural phenomenon into an urban phenomenon. Now, we're not going to see this completed until the 20th century. You can kind of think of it as like an 80-20 split, Basically, 80% of people were living out in the farmlands, 20% in urban centers. It really took until after World War II for that to shift. Today, we see 80% of people living in urban centers, 20% of people living within farming centers. But I think what's really important to remember out of this is this movement that we're starting to see, people moving into urban centers as agricultural techniques are taking over and basically replacing them. Again, getting back to that idea of creative destruction. Imperialism and migration. As the Industrial Revolution took off and people moved into these urban centers, there was a need to try and find more and more resources in other areas. And so Britain was going to argue for one of two things, which actually was rather contradictory. On the one hand, they argued for a free market system, meaning a lessening of tariffs within their country. They wanted to make sure that there was a competition between businesses. However, at the same time, they wanted a mercantilist system with their colonies outside so that they could gain the benefits of the resources in this area. That meant the benefit was to large plantation owners in the colonies for the empire, where mass production could take place of resources that could then be sold back to Britain where they could make finished products. So there was a need for workers out in these colonies, and this attracted workers from all over the world. People from India, Southeast Asia, South Africa, and Australia would move from place to place in order to try to find labor on these major plantations. Workers were often then exploited for their labor at cheap prices for production of cash crops like rice in Burma. You could kind of almost analogize this today to what we're seeing with sweatshops. Just like today, people move from rural areas into urban areas in a lot of the developing world in order to find sweatshop labor. The same was taking place here, except the difference being that it was taking place on farmlands out in these developing world countries, where they would basically create these raw resources that then could be shipped back to places like Britain, where they could make a finished product and then sell that out to the rest of the world. So I think what's really important then for this early modern period to remember is what's happening with migration and urbanization. Like we talked about before, in the 1800s, there was a dramatic shift in the world population away from rural areas into urban centers. Urbanization did allow for a lot of huge positive results. It allowed for greater factory productivity. Medical facilities were going to develop because we moved away from fluids theory into germ theory. Sanitation was going to develop in such a way over time that would basically remove that problem that we've seen of mass spreading of disease. And there was an improved relative wage growth, meaning that even when workers were paid low wages inside of urban centers, it was still relatively better than what they had been paid in rural areas. That means a middle class began to arise in places like Britain, the United States, Germany, and France. This meant the growth of consumer markets for luxury goods. And agricultural areas became more dominated, as we talked about before, by new technologies that would allow for workers to be replaced. So things like fertilizers, barbed wire, and the diesel engine, replacing workers. So what conclusions can we draw from this huge story about migration going back to the classical era? Human migration in the classical era was tied up in the development of land-based empires. The post-classical age saw a conflict between expansive land-based empires and those migrants from the steppe region. As we move out of that time period, we start to see the modern period really being shaped more, not by the establishment of empires or the migration of people into empires, but by global economic changes and things like mercantilism and the Industrial Revolution. And probably the most important thing that's really going to impact us now for the rest of the course is migrants moving from rural centers into urban centers in order to help with mass production. And that really changes everything that we're going to do, because what we're going to see in the 20th century is a movement from people in urban areas into suburban areas as economies become even more complicated and more intense in their trade across the world.